Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. On the stage with me, I have Jaime Schorr, who's the Chief Procurement Officer of Remain, Jenny Hedderman, who is, I don't know your title just as right off the top of my head, Jenny, so you're going to have to help me there.
Hi, this is Jenny. I'm Risk Counsel with the Office of the Comptroller in Massachusetts.
And then Jonathan Walker, who is with State of Louisiana, and Leah, who is with StateRAMP. So today we're talking about public procurement and tech standards / security. This was a topic that is near and dear to several of your hearts, and so this was a good one to pick up. One of the main ways that we're trying to deal with the overall topic of how we drive what procurement's role is in thinking about tech standards and how it extends it has been expressed through StateRAMP, which is a new effort that Leah's helping to lead. So since she's our special guest today and joined Clubhouse specifically to be here with us today, why don't we let her kick off with a quick intro of herself and tell us what StateRAMP is. And that's not the only thing that we have to talk about today, but certainly it'll be a core part of what we talk about. So Leah, why don't you jump us off?
Well, thank you so much. And I'm so glad to see my friend Jaime Schorr on the panel as well. She can talk about StateRAMP certainly as well as I can, but I have the privilege of serving as the executive director for StateRAMP, and my last name is McGrath. So I'm Leah McGrath. And I have had a chance to work with the steering committee who came together in 2020 to really, answer a question of what if states and local governments and the service providers who serve state and local government could come together to recognize a common set of standards for verifying cloud security, and therefore recognize a common method of verifying cloud security, so that states and local governments could really kind of work together in leveraging a shared resource of verification, and then providers could benefit from a verify once, serve many model. And so the challenge that these individuals, the steering committee, who represent a dozen current and former state CIOs, CISOs, privacy officers, and procurement officers, Jaime is a part of our steering committee, as well as cybersecurity assessing organizations and and other service providers, to just come together to, kind of walk that journey. And what came out of 2020, in addition to a really extraordinary time that we were all living through, we also spent about 1,000 hours trying to kind of walk that journey and answer those questions. And StateRAMP was born out of those discussions and born out of the steering committee. And StateRAMP is a nonprofit. We just launched, and so appreciate the opportunity to talk about a little bit more today about what that means and what the opportunities are.
Hey, Dustin, I'll just quickly dive in. Jaime, the CPO from the fabulous, wonderful, amazing state of, not just the state of Maine, Dustin. And for those of you that have not had the opportunity to work with Leah is the epitome of collaboration and customer service and efficient communication all in one. So if you're ever looking for tips on how to effectively collaborate, Leah is your person to talk to. She's been amazing. And right, if all of us think back to when we were kids and mom would tell us that she was serving like Brussels sprouts and liver and onions for dinner, it makes us all cringe. It was the dinner that we would try to run away from and never want to eat ever again in our life. Well, that is what many CPOs feel when it comes to entering into technology contracts and technology negotiations. It is it's different, it's hard, it is something that all of CPOs, and I would add additionally CIOs and CISOs are grappling with, because it changes so quickly. It feels like once we get into a practice and a process, the world changes again when it comes to technology. Jenny can probably talk much better than I can around risk management and advising state government how to avoid that risk. But in terms of, Dustin, how you presented the room, right, what works there's a couple things that, as we were talking through the StateRAMP process, we wanted to think about creating from a procurement perspective. And when you think about the beginning of the procurement process, trying to select your vendor, and then all the way through managing your contract, administering with your vendor, and having a successful partnership, we wanted to think about having a standardized approach to cybersecurity, setting some minimum requirements that the state would entertain in order to move forward with contract negotiations, and a consistency in RFPs, right? Every state does things a little bit different. Every municipality does things a little bit different, which makes the bidders challenged to have to pivot to every single requirement in an RFP when they're all different. And then ultimately, the states are looking for best value with these technology vendors so that we can save some costs, right? We're looking out for taxpayer dollars, and if vendors incur additional expenses every time they submit an RFP, well, guess who that cost gets passed on to? It's the state or the local government. So I'm super appreciative, Leah, that you were able to join us today. I'm very, very excited. I'm super passionate about StateRAMP, and anybody else that can certainly share around what they've done to make technology contracting a little bit easier. I think that's a conversation we should always entertain.
So you're all invited to pick up everyone on the panel is equally capable of coming off and talking. I am going to point that talking stick to Jenny, though, since this is her, this is a softball in the tee for you, Jenny. This is your area. So tell us what your thoughts are about this topic.
Thank you, Justin. This is Jenny. So in Massachusetts, we have really aspired to what Jaime is talking about, which is trying to standardize the IT and technology and security type term. So we have Commonwealth boilerplates. They're available on the Comptroller's website, also the Operational Services Division website. And we incorporated by reference standard IT terms. And the big ones that most IT firms had issue with, at least for states, was indemnification and limitations of liability. So we actually worked with our IT department and the Attorney General's office to come up with a baseline standard for all types of IT contracts with a minimum amount and maximum amounts. And there's certain type of indemnification, which we have an unlimited amount, which is for personal injury and property damage. And the AG is just not willing to negotiate that. They want the ability to have unlimited liability. So when we do procurements, those boilerplates are front and center, and all contractors know that those are going to be the expectations. We also recently, in the past year, incorporated the enterprise security standards into our contract boilerplate so that would be the Commonwealth standard. And that if we had a third-party vendor coming in, that they would have to meet those standards if they were going to work with the Commonwealth. And then IT procurements also have a series of technology-related questions. And this is really just to create a foundation for all contracts, and then you add from there. I think the biggest risks that we see coming are with third-party vendors, issues with SolarWinds and hosting and MSSPs, not necessarily paying enough attention on the back end for security, and that creates risks for states and municipal government and the federal government when they're doing business. So I think in the federal area, they're really ramping up on making sure that their third-party vendors meet a certain baseline standard. And I think we will see that as states kind of collaborate, like Leah's group, which is doing just a fantastic job. And I'm not sure if Massachusetts is part of that, but if they're not, I'd love them to be part of that. But this consistency, so vendors really know. And the reason why that's important is vendors really need to raise the stakes internally. And I think the biggest change that we've seen is that security, privacy, technology standards are not luxury add-ons. They really are part of the day-to-day operational business that you're doing, whether you're a private or a government entity. And I think that, creating this standard really is the most important step that we're seeing down the horizon. This is Jenny out.
Hey, Jenny, real quick on a follow-up to that. When Massachusetts gets down the road on the negotiations or entering the contract, and you find that your vendor is just not meeting your risk standards. Is Massachusetts willing and or have you walked away from the vendor in the contract to work with a different vendor?
We've seen a little bit of everything. It really depends. If there's only one game in town and we really are kind of beholden to do business with one vendor, then the negotiations are a little bit more difficult. If you have multiple vendors that can do the work, then some state agencies have walked away. And sometimes in the middle of a contract when they just weren't able to meet those standards or they weren't willing to invest in continually meeting the standards. But ultimately, I think most states can make the business decision to negotiate terms in the best interest of the Commonwealth. And then if there's an issue, then they're responsible for assuming those risks. So it is a business decision ultimately, but we've seen both walking away, negotiation in amounts, like getting a reduced amount for that risk. So all over the place. Jenny.
So, Jonathan, I'll ask you to chime in while I'm doing that. I'll make sure people in the room know that we're recording the first half hour for a podcast, since a lot of the public procurement audience still hasn't made their way to Clubhouse, which I release under the podcast called Public Procurement Change Agents. So the first 25 minutes or so, we tend to work with the panel so that we're able to deal with the fact that it's recorded. So please do raise your hand if you have questions. But I'm probably going to let the panel go through a few points before I bring anybody up, just as FYI. So Jonathan, you've heard some really good discussion on some state pieces, and then the intro to Liam. Are you involved with StateRAMP or interested in it, or tell me how you guys are dealing with some of these topics?
Yes, thank you. Jonathan Walker, State of Louisiana. So we have some points in our favor, which is that in addition to being a central procurement state, we're also a central IT state, which helps greatly. And I think one of the things that isn't written down anywhere, but is a really good piece of advice, is invest in having a good relationship between your CPO and your CIO. That's worked wonders in Louisiana, that there aren't the sort of territorial battles that might otherwise ensue. There's so many, potential points of friction. In Louisiana, we're blessed. We're fortunate to not have those. Not so much because the law is clear, because it's not, but because the people involved in clear are clear and pointed in the same direction, parallel to each other. The other thing that helps is that we have a strong information security policy that we prominently disclose on any of our bids, or obviously our RFPs as well. So anybody who's looking to get involved can see up front what the security standards are. And thankfully, and I was surprised when I learned this, because I'm not an expert. This is probably the first Clubhouse chat where I don't feel like I have expertise in the topic, or significant experts say. But what I can say is that it doesn't just address what I consider digital security. So it's not just about encryption and, VPN access and these other topics. It also has stuff as seemingly mundane as how often do you change the locks on your buildings? Who has badge access into your server room? Things like that, which again, I wouldn't have thought of, but so it's not just digital security, it's also physical security in, furtherance of digital security. So we disclose that. I think the big area for opportunity is to unite our approach with that of other states. Because as has been said, there's nothing really unique to Louisiana's need for digital security. It would be really great if instead of having the 60-page information security policy listed, we could go a step further and say the state has adopted, StateRAMP or its equivalent. Anybody who knows what they're doing can see that and say, okay, I can do that or I can't do that. Whether they meet that standard or not, they know exactly what that standard is. And they know that contracting with Louisiana won't be a heavy lift, or a pain in the neck compared to contracting with Maine or Massachusetts. So thank you.
Maybe an easy example, as I ask Leah to think about coming back on here, as someone who responds to different opportunities at state and local levels, insurance requirements are literally all over the map, from geographic location and even within. And it's a little frustrating but you just tend to buy the highest level insurance that the one requires and then try to remember it over time. But that's just simply annoying. But if you're building a software package and one entity has a wildly different set of expectations on the way that you code or develop or where things live, that's not just annoying. That's probably a game stop in terms of being able to actually proceed on selling your software into places. So Leah, what stood out to me on the quick call that we had a couple of days ago was talking about that verify once, leverage often model, where trying to talk about not only does it help raise the standards, but it also means that people can know what the target is and they know how to develop so that they're able to drive some consistent compliance with things like NIST and the rest. So talk about that philosophy and how you're trying to help both the suppliers and the governments kind of come to a common ground.
Absolutely. Well, and you bring up insurance or you talk about indemnification, and those are activities that are really on the back end. That's after something bad has already happened and they're react kind of remedies at that point in time. But, where we're really trying to shift, and StateRAMP's heart is around, education of best practices and driving for standardization so that everyone has a level playing field and knows what the expectations are, as you said, so you know what you're striving toward. We worked with, on our steering committee, we have representatives from the National Association of State Chief Information Officers and from NASCO as well. And what was helpful there is just data and getting information. So we know that the majority of states, if not all, have adopted a cybersecurity framework based on NIST. That's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That's also what FedRAMP is based on as well. And those include, it's NIST 800-53 Rev 4 or now Rev 5 is basically a catalog of security controls. So Jonathan, what you were talking about, right? It's not just penetration testing and privileges, but it's also your physical environment and things like how often you change locks on the door and who has access to your building. It's all of those different control families that are really important and, a part of how you can ensure that the third party providers you're working with are meeting your. And so there are some best practices that we were able to leverage, but we are trying to bring states and local governments together to recognize that common set of standards, which I think can help ease the friction that happens in procurement on both sides. So we've talked to a number of providers. We presented to it, I think it's over 1,300 providers now, and had many one-on-one calls. And we continue to hear feedback around the challenge, just like states are struggling between their chief information officers and their procurement officers and offices to figure out how to verify. The providers are struggling right now with one-off procurement requirements that may vary from state to state or even within a state from agency to agency. So there's a lot to be gained, kind of setting the requirements, the baseline requirements, so that everyone knows this is what it means and this is what is expected if you're going to do business in government.
So I'll just jump in on the procurement process itself and how StateRAMP can be super helpful if that's good with folks. Right. So there's I would say like a 7-step process for procurement folks to think about when utilizing StateRAMP. Start out with setting your control requirements with the CISO, maybe the CIO and or the business owner. Identify the StateRAMP impact level category. And Leah, feel free to chime in anytime. There's 3 different categories. Category 1 is equivalent to like a FedRAMP low control. Category 2 is FedRAMP low plus moderate controls, and then category 3 is FedRAMP moderate. So you've got to work with your CIO and your CISO to figure out which one makes the most sense, and then identify the security status level of the vendor. Set the status level deadline, like when do they have to be StateRAMP authorized by what time frame. I think it's unreasonable to expect that as we put out RFPs that vendors are going to be StateRAMP authorized the day you put out the RFP. So we would need to say you can be authorized by a certain a certain time frame. And then let's set the continuous monitoring. That's all throughout the RFP development phase, right? When we get to the evaluation and award, it's important to confirm the impact level and compliance with what I call the 3 PAO, which is really the 3 PAO, the third party, right, Leah, the third party assessing organization. And then we continue to kind of weave StateRAMP through the whole process, right through to contract administration, where we can confirm the compliance and continuous monitoring. So I think that's a really critical component that the procurement officers were able to have the discussions with StateRAMP and embed the procurement process throughout StateRAMP. And as we start to think about how it can be helpful, StateRAMP helps us not only draft the procurement documents to select the vendor, StateRAMP actually helps us as we select the vendor throughout while we're negotiating, contract implementation, and then execution, administration, and management. Leah, what have I missed?
Well, the thing that it's that management, the contract management after the fact too. So one of the differences I think that StateRAMP brings to the table too is that continuous monitoring. So we know that cloud security, if you have an audit completed, that's a one moment in time. So what becomes really important when you're talking about how to provide for a strong cybersecurity policy is to have continuous monitoring. And so to be authorized by StateRAMP, we have, security requirements that must be verified by a third-party assessing organ. But then once that has happened, then to stay authorized, the providers have to comply with continuous monitoring requirements. So there's ongoing reporting. And the benefit to that is very few states, I've not talked to one yet, have the budget or bandwidth to manage continuous monitoring for all of their third-party providers with whom they work. And providers don't have the budget or bandwidth to provide that level of reporting to all of the states and government agencies that they work with. But through a centralized kind of program management office, we can manage that. And then we can also, for governments who partner with StateRAMP, we have kind of a membership agreement or letter of agreement. We can provide that security official an account into our secure portal so they can view that continuous monitoring reporting with the providers that they work with so that they have that constant flow of information. And if there is a problem that arises, right, something does happen, or maybe a vendor falls out of compliance, then the states and local governments can be notified of that so that, the whole point of StateRAMP, all procurement decisions stay with state and locals always. But what StateRAMP can do is make visible the cyber postures of the providers so that then the states can make decisions, risk-based decisions that are right. And so that's the continuous monitoring aspect. And part of, I think, the culture shift that we're trying to help with as well is to try to help shift that culture or that mindset around cybersecurity to be one of continuous improvement and continuous monitoring. So there's no kind of once and done.
So Jenny,
for procurement,
please go ahead, Jamie.
Sorry, Dustin. And for procurement officials, right, this is one more tool in the toolbox to bridge the gap between the CIO, the CISO, and procurement. And then it's another way for us to help track and make sure that we don't have failed IT projects. When we're investing, $50 to $100 million in an IT software system, we get off the ground, and then 2 years later we figure out that.
I think we lost Jamie. Maybe she was in one of those famous Maine covered bridges somewhere. I don't know. So Jenny, this is your space. We've talked a lot about StateRAMP, and I think there's some great stuff to it. And I know you're in rooms where you talk about security all the time. So what haven't we talked about as it relates to tech standards so far, and how it crosses over into procurement that you may want to help pick us up a topic on? And while you're chewing on how you're going to answer that, I'll let people know that I'll start letting some folks come up onto the stage and ask their question. Emily's been waiting patiently. Realize when you do come up that I am still recording the session so that I can clip out at least a good half hour. So that's part of coming up on stage. So Jenny, what have we not talked about yet that should be part of our discussion?
I think we covered, a lot so far, but I think one thing to keep in mind is that security, IT, technical standards are really not an IT responsibility. I think that people should be thinking a little bit broader than that IT is just one part of it, but it also is your operational policy, how your individual staff are going to be using the technology, the type of data that you're processing, what you're collecting, how you're using it, how you're storing it, how you're dispersing it. So I really think that people have thought for years that cybersecurity and IT was really just in the IT office. But the reality is it crosses all areas of your organization. So it's good to be communicating with all areas of your organization, similar to what Jonathan is doing in Louisiana. I really think that is the new way of doing business and really getting rid of the silos and communicating across all levels of the organization. That's the only way that it's going to be successful, because if you don't pay attention at all levels, that's where you're going to get the gaps. And that's where operations fall down, is in the gaps, not in the main part of production. Jenny out.
Okay, great. So to refresh the room, and then whoever started to speak, please come in. We're doing a weekly discussion with procurement practitioners about rotating topics. Today we're talking about tech standards and how procurement impacts it. We have the executive director for StateRAMP, which is seeking to reconcile standards that brings practitioners and state and local together to mirror and emulate some of what the feds have done in their successful program. So there's lots of different ways we can take it. If you haven't followed the club yet, please do, so that you get notified when we have events. Also, all the people on stage are practitioners that you should tag and follow, in my opinion. I'll let Emily come up and ask and be on stage. Somebody started to talk when I was refreshing the room, so please feel free to jump back in.
Sure, this is Leah. Jenny, I was just going to say, I've heard someone describe what you were describing as we need to think about, there's no such thing as an IT procurement. Everything is now an IT procurement, if you think of it that way, because there are so many services that couldn't be delivered without utilizing an IaaS, SaaS, or hybrid on-prem solution. And so that stood out to me as you were talking. I've heard a few different kind of shift their mindset, I think, around technology and security in that way.
So Emily, you are working with leadership at Georgetown to explore different approaches to teach digital fundamentals to public policy students, and are interested in learning about from interesting people. We have some of those on stage. So tell us what your question is, or add some value to our conversation.
Sure. A nugget about my background, probably relevant to this group, is that I'm one of the founding members of the U.S. Digital Service at the federal level, essentially like a startup that aims to kind of tackle a lot of the service delivery problems that of course, procurement is at the root of. A lot of what we talk about on the tech side, and modernizing technology and digital transformation and all of I just love the look on people's faces where I'm like, so how interested are you in talking about procurement? Because none of this is solvable about procurement. I have some tiny people in here, so you might hear them in the background. But one thing I really wanted to highlight here is that there are a couple of resources that might be useful. And then I have a question as well to ask you all. So the resource side is two things that you may or may not already be aware of, but for the folks in the audience, one is which is a guide that was created by the U.S. Digital Service in partnership with some acquisition folks that's big and exploring and approaches. Hi, tiny person. You know what? Let me pause and get back to children in front of the television. I'll be right back.
I'm fairly certain that at least I know three of us have. Well, I don't have tiny people at home. I have very large people, but okay, we're all in the zone. So
sorry.
No worries, Emily. Go ahead.
So the TechFAR, which is just Tech TECHFAR, is basically a resource that was created by the U.S. acquisition folks, side of acquisitions, inside out and backwards, to help guide procurement who are writing the RFPs on the business side, to write them in a way as close as possible to to agile software models. So that is thing one. Thing two is 18F, a sister organization of the U.S. Bill Service, has also put out a lot of open source resources on various kinds of procurement models that they tested, again, at the federal level. I actually feel like what 18F has been doing might be more relevant to the state level. And that includes things like micro contracting and other things in that realm. So essentially testing on a small scale, building in the open, and things of that nature. And then the third one is something called the Chief Data Officer Network, run out of the Beck Center at Georgetown. But this is basically a collective of chief data officers from across the country. And the relationship of Georgetown to this is that they essentially serve as a convening force. But there's a lot of really interesting information sharing happening there in case that's relevant to doing. So the question I have is, have you seen work at the state level for bringing tech talent to the table as procurements are being drafted? So meaning, you have the business that is asking for something. How at the state level are you finding the ability to bring in people who have a hands-on keyboard sort of direct connection to how modern software is developed, who can actively craft that RFP, craft that procurement?
Great. So Emily, since your phone popped in and out or your connection popped in just and out a little bit, I'll just restate. It's about how do we, when we're crafting some of these standards, how do we make sure that the technology people have the role so that it's going to be able to effective. And I do also want to thank you for bringing some of the perspective on what the feds are doing. There is a lot of good and interesting culture coming out of GSA. In this room, we generally tend to focus on the state and local experience. So it's really good to have somebody who understands some of the Fed experience as well, because obviously there's a lot to that. So anyone on the stage want to talk about how do you involve the tech folks and make sure that it's the right level so that it's in that Goldilocks style, that it's not too much and it's not too little? Anybody want to chime in?
So of course, I'm always happy to chime in, Dustin. We have we have 6 people dedicated in the procurement office who we've actually pulled out of the IT group. And they are responsible for understanding the world of technology vendors and what's out there in the marketplace. And they are really, I can't say this enough, they are the key to being the liaison between procurement and IT and business. They speak multiple languages, right? They speak the procurement language, they speak the IT language, and at times they will speak the appropriate business language. And I think having that knowledge and expertise of the right people and the right team, the right conversations at the right time is critical. Because if you put a CIO and a CPO in the room together, they're going to talk different languages and the communication will break down. And the same thing, if you put the procurement officer with the business without the IT person in there, it's going to break down. So you've got to have the right temperature of communication. Now, all that being said, Dustin, I think you restated the question very appropriately when you say, how do you bring in the right resources so that it's not too heavy or too light? And that seems to be one of the trickiest components that we've experienced in our state. If we tread lightly on the knowledge and experience as we're trying to select vendors, we find that we can trip up later on. Whereas if we're too heavy with the experience and the knowledge about what we're buying, we can also trip up just because we tend to poke holes in things that don't need holes poked in them. So I think it's sort of a balancing act. Now, all that being said, Maine is one of the newer states that have built in an IT procurement group within procurement. So other states do things a little bit differently, where IT stays off on their own, or they're all within one division. But I cannot say enough that having the knowledge and expertise around a technology background to interpret the language within the procurement office has been critical to selecting the right vendors and engaging in the right conversation at the right time.
Thank you, Jaime. Can I ask a follow-up just real quick?
Sure.
Go for it.
Awesome. So another question I have for you all, since a lot of my comes down to the state level, is how to effectively navigate the world of repeat. What am I trying to say here? The problem that I'd like to get your insight into is one thing that we see quite a lot is that vendors who chronically deliver very bad technology that simply does not work continue to get awarded contracts, big dollar. And the reason, my understanding is because there are these requirements that stipulate that the award must be made to a company that has demonstrated delivery of a software that reaches X amount of users on X issue. You can probably guess who I'm talking about. And at no point is the question, did they deliver a thing that actually worked? But they get the award just because they have built it, even though it was awful from every perspective that you can look at it. There's one particular case I'm thinking about where a company has gotten like 5 or 6 awards for building the same terrible dysfunctional software all over the country. And I'm just wondering, like, A, how do you all think about that? And B, is there anything that we can do to mitigate that? Because every time I've seen someone try and step up and be honest, I see backlashes, particularly at the state level, where people have to reverse their reviews. So in any case, I would love your thoughts on that.
Hey, Emily, thanks for all your insight and input and your questions. My name's Christina, and I am located down here in South Florida, and I recently signed on with Civic, but I had handled South Florida procurement for about 10 years. And one of the bigger projects I did was for the Southeast Florida Co-op, the drone supply contract. And negotiating that was extremely interesting. There was one kind of vendor who came up and floated to the surface as far as the responses, and it was best value. So that would kind of be the first part of my answer to you on that, is that to make sure that it's not a low bid situation. This is, if it's solution based, and if it's something that the agency or the entity, is embarking on, new ground here that they really have not done before, like in the drone example, absolutely, there needs to be room for those open ends. I feel like, again, if it's going to be something that's too rigid, then the vendors really, are going to have a hard time coming to the table. So in that example, we're dealing with, I think it was at least 15 or 20 agencies that had put in quantities out of our like 30 or 40 agency co-op. And so there was a lot of voices at the table, and there was just a lot of concerns of making it work for everybody. And obviously many different codes and many different types of terms and conditions. So allowing that to be a heavily negotiated contract in that case was how we kind of tipped the pendulum and were able to have success. And then real quick to the end of that, I'm not going to name any vendors or any counties in this, but there is a very big case going on down here in the county adjacent to me where a certain brand of laptops were purchased over like at least 2 different bid outs, kept on getting purchased to the tune of $5, $10, $15 million. I mean, huge money here because it's a school system. And so even though there was a lot of, complaints and a lot of issues with this particular laptop provider for the school system, they, again, when that contract came up in the next 4 years for that 5th year, they got awarded again. And because they outbid everybody else again. So to that earlier point about the drones, I think that, again, both of these are a little bit more supply-based, but do involve software, and it still is in that IT realm. And I would say that, making sure that we are on a best value basis and a life cycle basis as well with evaluations, where we're not stuck with the low bidder, especially when we're talking about, taxpayer dollars as with any of these procurements. So that would be my biggest concern, and that would be kind of my offering to part of your question there, Christina. Out.
So I'll pick it back up and bring it to Leah by making a comment, and then also sort of doing a semi-last call for questions. If you're new to the room, several people joined. There was a semi-competing room about tech sourcing. So I saw several people come in as that room kind of petered out. We're talking with practitioners in state and local. We're generally talking about how procurement interacts with tech standards. We have the executive director for StateRAMP, which is an effort to try to create a reconciliation point among practitioners and state and local on the stage with us. So Leah, I want you to think about the question about, does StateRAMP both have a role in certifying people who are compliant? And then what happens if someone comes remedial? Have you even thought of that kind of scenario? As we go to there, I'll just say that the question has, to me, more to do with the discussion about how to actually get true references and true calls from people on what was the performance of vendors. And there are some experts in Clubhouse and friends of mine who could participate in that conversation. Jennifer in the audience, I'm sure, has some thoughts about referenceability, and David Yarkin, who's not on, I'm sure does as well. But I'll just say in general, public procurement ought to think about both that when they're doing references, that they require that they both recent and relevant. Sometimes we will allow people to carry around a reference from 10 years ago, even though their last 5 have been awful. So I think that's a very easy thing for any level of bid, is to think about making people demonstrate that they are referenceable or that it's recent and relevant. Another important thing is to actually do the reference calls, and even go so far as, if it's a big project, even doing like actual site visits. And the number one question that I find opens up the door to have people actually answer the question accurately is saying, how would you help me manage that? What advice would you give me on managing this vendor? Because even if people naturally don't want to, they don't want to beat up on a person, if you say, how do I manage this person? Or how do I manage this situation? Generally, that opens the floodgates to whatever their actual experience was. So Leah, have you guys thought about, obviously you're focused right now on getting people to attain a level. Does StateRAMP have any role in saying what happens if people consistently miss this kind of thing? I don't want to put you on the spot. I find it to be an interesting question.
We actually have had, thank you so much for that. We've had quite a bit. And so for those who may have just joined with StateRAMP, we just launched. We're a nonprofit 501c6. We're organizing as a 501c6 organization. And, we will be publishing and maintaining an authorized vendor list that is a way to verify cloud security of providers and help states and local governments manage that third-party risk. But yes, we've talked quite a bit about that, Dustin, and I would encourage folks to go to stateramp.org. And if you go to stateramp.org/documents, you can see some of the policies in place that actually will guide that. So in order to maintain a listing on the authorized vendor list, if a provider has achieved a security status of ready or authorized, then in order to maintain that status, continuous monitoring is required. And so we have, as a nonprofit, we have a board of directors and we have some standing committees. And one of our standing committees is the appeals committee. And our committees, our board, are all comprised of majority of state and local government officials, but also have minority representation from industry and from subject matter experts, so that we can try to make sure we're meeting the needs of all the stakeholders. If there's a situation where a vendor continuously is not complying, and if you go to that stateramp.org/documents, you'll see the continuous monitoring guide and some of the requirements for compliance. If we have a vendor who is continuing to not comply with the requirements or has a problem, then that situation, the program management office would make a recommendation that could be, hey, they need to be delisted, or maybe there's an interim step that at the very least, we're going to have a call with all the states that we know who are working with this vendor so we can talk about this problem and make it visible so that they can take steps to be safe. But the appeals committee serves as the adjudication committee for those sorts of decisions. And so if there is a situation where the PMO is recommending that someone lose an authorization, that would go through the appeals committee to make that final determination. But you know, it's what we've been talking about, right? Is as we try to shift around cybersecurity compliance to, it's not just a one audit and done. It's why that continuous monitoring and continuous improvement is so important.
Great. So, so Jennifer, you jumped up, and you know, of course, that we're recording. And then, so please form out your question. And then if anybody else had a question, Raj, I see you down there. If you had any gem you wanted to drop in, then you can feel free to jump up, and we'll try to wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. So Jennifer, why don't you contribute something to the room?
Hey, everyone. It's Jennifer Salentic with Compare Co-ops. We, our new tool, allows public aides to find and get quotes from cooperative purchasing contracts. And one of the most popular parts of our tool is a Q&A section that's enabled. And when you're talking about these types of questions that are tricky, right? How do you find references? How do you know if someone's done a good job in the past? That's really something that, with our software, I would love to get some feedback from the room on, obviously everything that goes through our platform is public procurement. But how interested would the group be on being able to know, when one of your peers has done a similar procurement, and being able to potentially see how that quote request looked, and also being able to potentially connect with each other, through the platform as well. And if that would be something that you already find out there, or if that would be something valuable.
I think, I think it is valuable. And I think we're sort of almost verging on like what our next week kind of topic is, because there's just, there's so much that's involved in the question about referenceability and knowing the experience of others. And I know that there's such a rich knowledge base in people like you and David and maybe Maureen or Marielle and so forth, where maybe we pick up this topic in its own bucket. Not trying to keep us from talking about it, but I think that you raise a good point as far as knowing how people work and know. And I think trying to keep it somewhat towards like, how do we keep the tech standards consistent, just means that we can sort of, connect the topics. I don't know if anybody had a better answer for Jennifer than I did, but Jennifer, I mean, if we don't have a great answer for you today, I'd invite you to help me plan out another call where we can have that be the central focus.
I think it's a great topic, and I definitely think it's something, I get asked similar questions a lot, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to pose it to the room. Obviously, David's procurated resource, that's why that exists. But yeah, I'd love to talk about it further on another day and, get some additional thought.
Well, the content machine needs to be constantly fed. So I'm not putting it off. I'm saying it should kind of be its own thing. So you're welcome to hang out with us on stage, Jennifer. Let's do two more discussions as we close out the session. So Bharat, I know that you've been in a couple of rooms with me, and you're interested in supply chain topics. So why don't you pose a quick comment to the room, and then we'll come to Raj, and then we'll close out for.
Hey, my question is, many startups have to rely on authentication as a service provider, such as Okta and Auth0. And I've been very reliant on FedRAMP's, configuration rules when it comes to authentication. They have you have to disable accounts in 90 days. You can't. The login session cannot last more than 15 minutes, and simple rules such as this. I'm just curious, what are the differences between when it comes to the login and logout sessions and hashing and kind of protecting passwords? What are the differences between FedRAMP and StateRAMP that I should be looking out for? Thank you.
So Leah, I know that you educated me on that FedRAMP is not necessarily certifying companies, they're certifying products, and there's certain limitations on you have to be involved in federal projects, but you guys follow similar standards, right? So maybe expand that out a little.
Absolutely. So I think I would invite you to go to stateramp.org/documents. And a really good example of what I'm going to describe for you would be our minimum mandatory requirements for ready status. These are the baseline minimum mandatory requirements. And then you can also see a document for baseline controls. And here in a couple of weeks, we're actually opening up membership, and we'll publish more templates that will give you a very clear understanding as to what the requirements are. But largely, they're very, what I would say that you'll see as differences between StateRAMP and FedRAMP is that we have the benefit of learning from the FedRAMP experience. So we had a lot of people on the steering committee who were either assessors or providers who have gone through FedRAMP or who have worked even at the FedRAMP PMO, who are able to help kind of guide how do we make StateRAMP more clear in guidance where maybe there's some ambiguity with FedRAMP, and then also maybe where there's very rigid prescriptive requirements on FedRAMP, how can StateRAMP be more flexible to really be about driving toward intent? Are you meeting the intent of the control and the requirement? And so we will be publishing more templates and more guidance documents to that point here in the next few weeks. So I'd invite you to go to stateramp.org. You can also sign up for updates so you can see those requirements as they're published. And I think that'll be really helpful. On the specific questions that you were asking, however, I think there's very similar, there are best practices, right? In terms of when you would need to delete an account and things like that. So you'll see a lot of similarities. The controls, the control families are nearly identical. It's really just how they're.
Excellent.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So, so Raj, will come to you to, I know that you are very knowledgeable on the Fed side and state side, and then you do a lot with young companies that are trying to come up and serve. So I'm sure you have something great to bring to the room as we kind of turn the corner here. So why don't you jump in and say hello and contribute to the room.
Hi, everyone. Hey, thank you, Dustin. Thanks for hosting as always. And great to see everyone. I will admit I'm not a deep expert on this topic. What I hear, though, I know just from the federal standpoint, the whole, I'm sure you all have heard, the rollout of some of the new cyber standards has been a total disaster. There wasn't a lot of thought put towards really the complexity of the requirements being put forward, and then the cost and implications to especially the small business community, and where many companies have basically said the cost is going to be way too high to be able to comply, and they'd rather just kind of walk away. And so I'm just curious. I know this seems honestly like a much better process here on the state side. And I just asked my team to look into this and potentially touch base with some of you to learn more. But I think, we're working with a lot of smaller companies. Our mission is GovShop is partly to bring kind of leading edge tech companies and others into the government market. And so I think, it's a challenge, right? Like for all of us. And so I'm just curious, I know we have limited time left, but how have you engaged or looked at the cost and compliance side of things and what the impact might be to smaller companies?
I assume that's a question for me. So this is Leah with StateRAMP. Thank you for your question. And I have to tell you, as Jaime can attest, I think of the 1,000 hours of meetings that we had in 2020, there was not a meeting where we didn't talk about the need to balance, I'm going to say user-friendly or business-friendly with the integrity of what a verification. It's really critical that, the providers who are doing business with state and local governments are secure, because governments have the responsibility of, protecting citizen data and the integrity of the government and the continuity of government services. But we also have to do that in a way that, providers are able to deliver. And so we've talked about it in a couple of ways. One is our mission is education. We want providers to be successful. And so what you'll see, especially over time, developing with StateRAMP is more resources, more samples, more education. That what I described earlier from, StateRAMP's PMO and verification of cyber standards and compliance, it's really going to be driven toward, intent and purpose versus a very prescriptive way to, comply. Are you complying? With the intent and purpose of that control. The other thing is we've talked a lot about giving enough time and enough runway for providers to become compliant, realizing you don't flip a switch and suddenly everybody is able to be authorized, right? There has to be enough time. And that's where I think Jaime had mentioned earlier in the discussion, incorporating those time requirements into RFPs or contracts. So maybe you require a provider to be authorized within 12 months of executing a contract. And, there are steps. You could be StateRAMP ready before you're StateRAMP authorized if those are steps that you want to take that help you get there. And so those steps and the time allowed is part of, I think, how to help providers, in addition to the education and resources that we'll be hoping to provide. The last thing I would say on the FedRAMP, we heard a lot of providers during the steering committee discussions, where a number of providers talk about when they were becoming FedRAMP authorized, they essentially were hiring, or when they were authorizing through FedRAMP, they would essentially hire 2 third-party assessing organizations, one to be the consultant to get you ready, and then one to take you through the audit. And so our goal through the education and resources is over time to really reduce that need for the consultant. I mean, from a provider perspective, depending on where you are, if you've developed code and it's legacy code and you didn't think about cybersecurity, you might need help in getting that up to speed. But if it's newer code, if you are, thought about cybersecurity, you have policies in place, then our goal would really be to reduce the need for that first consultant, which reduces the cost greatly. But then the last benefit, I think, is by reducing these kind of one-off procurement requirements or having a more standardized approach is really going to help reduce just the extra time and dollars that can go into responding to RFPs too. So those are some of the ways that I'd love, reach out to me. We are launching StateRAMP. We'll open up membership in a few weeks here in mid-April and publish templates so that assessments can begin. But this is, I'm going to call it version 1.0. A lot of really great work went into developing kind of this foundation. But we know that as we get started, we're going to learn a lot. We're going to see what works. We're going to see what could be better. And so we want that feedback and input as well. So if your team does reach out to us, Raj, would be happy to talk further.
That would be great. Thank you so much. That was very helpful. And we'll definitely reach out because I think we'd like to really refer them to some of the great resources, et cetera, you have, and potentially set up an education session. I think it will be great for them. So thank you for all your work. I think, I like I said, in my first look at it and just listening to this conversation, I appreciate all the work and thought that's been put behind this.
Thank you.
Dustin, could
Yes,
I
please.
add something real quick
Sure.
on tech standards? I'll make it quick. I know you're trying to wrap up. So one thing I just wanted to note, as someone who is not a procurement person specifically, I come at this largely from the product and the service side, having had to kind of think about the procurement piece of the puzzle. One thing I just wanted to sort of note as y'all are thinking through standards is that part of the problem from my vantage point has been that sometimes the standards are not sufficient, or sometimes they are not clear, or sometimes they're misunderstood by people. So one of the things to look at when you are trying to create a particular outcome via a technology that you are that you are presumably creating this procurement to deliver, is to make sure that you're thinking about the usability of the thing you are creating. So we often are forced to think about sort of success through this checkbox mentality of like, I have met the following standards, therefore this is secure, or I have met the following standards, therefore this is private or usable or fill in the blank. But that we need to be able to also assess our products' successes and the outcomes that we want to achieve by looking at what they actually look like in use and whether or not they are having the intended outcome. And I think this gets a little bit to what Lee was saying about sort of creating an environment of continuous learning and continuous development that starts in the land of procurement. So I just wanted to put that out there for folks, because I know we talk a lot about standards, but standards are really just a piece of the puzzle in terms of having the outcome we desire. So please do bear that in mind as you think through your relationship to the standards and how to achieve them.
And Emily, I'm in addition to being a certified public procurement officer from part of my public time, I was a deputy CIO. So I have a lot of touch points over into the state and local side of the CIO side of the house as well. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn or whatnot, I sent you a note. I'm happy to work with you on some other content if you'd like. The name of the club is Public Sector Innovators, which hopefully you guys can all follow. So while our core pinnacle is around public procurement, I think there's definitely space to pick up state and local IT issues as well. So so Jaime, I don't know if you had to fall off into your next meeting, or if you're still here. Why don't you help us kind of bring the room to a wrap, and then I'll let either you or Jenny kind of take us out, and then we'll let people get on with their day.
Yeah, I'll make a short plug quickly for StateRAMP. For folks that are just learning about it, I really would encourage you to jump on stateramp.org, learn more about what that organization is doing. And then I made a recent public statement in a webinar and I said, IT procurement is hard. And I think Leah hit the nail on the head that there is no such thing as an IT procurement. Everything is an IT procurement, and it doesn't have to be hard. It may be a little bit more challenging to navigate the ins and outs of the security standards and the other requirements, but it is not nearly as complicated as probably it was 5 years ago. And maybe it's not as complicated as it will be 5 years from now, but we continue to build these fantastic tools like StateRAMP to help us navigate through the process. So I would be eager to hear if Jenny has anything else to close us out with today.
And hi, this is Jenny. Thank you, Jaime. And I totally agree. I think you make it simple by including the business owners that are really going to be using your product so that they get to ask the simple questions, which is this system going to go down? What do I do if it goes down? What happens if there's a data breach? All these different things that they're going to have to deal with in the trenches. You need to bring them into the room so that they can ask the questions about what it means to them. Also, don't deal with salespeople. Deal with the people who are actually going to be managing the product and are going to be on the customer service answering those questions, because the salespeople are going to sell you whatever you want to hear. But the people who are in the trenches doing the work, if you can't feel comfortable with them, then you're probably not going to want to do business with that company. So we've definitely implemented that, which has been a huge thing. And then for technology, if you don't have the ability to bring experts in, you can do requests for information, an RFI, and ask people to address certain questions and how they would resolve it. And that gives you kind of information that you can look at before you do your procurement. And it usually will make, especially your larger procurements, better. And that's it for me. Jenny out. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Jaime, and everybody else on the panel.
Well, since I have this great roadcaster, I'm going to have to hit my mic drop button. Here we go. So there you go. Jenny, that was a mic drop. So thank you guys for being on. We appreciate it. Leah, I hope you are interested enough to join us again in the future, even if we aren't specifically talking StateRAMP. I'm sure some of the topics may be interesting to you, and you did a great job.
Thank you so much.
Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent.